Hello, everyone. My name's Iman. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to finish up our lecture on sensation and perception. In the previous video, we covered vision and hearing, and today we're going to look at other sensory systems. In this objective, we're going to specifically talk about smell, taste, somatosensation, and the kinesthetic sense. Even though each of these senses detects different kinds of stimuli, they all follow the same basic principle that we've been discussing throughout this chapter. That basic principle is that specialized sensory receptors are going to detect information from either the external environment or the body itself. Then they're going to convert that information into neural signals, and finally, they will send those signals to the brain for interpretation. Keeping that in mind, let's talk about smell. Smell, or olfaction, allows us to detect volatile chemical molecules that are in the air. Every time you breathe in, there are thousands of different molecules that are going to enter your nasal cavity. Some of those molecules will dissolve in the mucus that's lining the roof of the nasal cavity. And there, they're going to interact with the specialized chemoreceptors that are located in the olfactory epithelium. These receptors are actually neurons, and on their surface, they have tiny projections called cilia. Those cilia contain receptor proteins that bind to specific odor molecules. When an odor molecule binds to one of those receptors, it's going to start a signaling cascade that generates a neural signal. Those signals are going to travel through the olfactory nerve to a structure called the olfactory bulb. And it is there that the information begins to be organized, and then it's sent deeper into the brain for further processing. Now, one unique feature of the olfactory system is that it has a particularly strong connection to parts of the limbic system, especially regions that are involved in emotion and memory. That's one of the reasons why a particular smell can sometimes trigger a past memory, or why it can cause you to have such a strong emotional response almost instantly. You'll also sometimes hear about pheromones when discussing smell. Pheromones are chemical signals that are released by one individual that can then influence the behavior or physiology of another member of the same species. Now, pheromones, they play an important role in communication in a lot of different animals. But in humans, it's not entirely known whether pheromones actually produce any meaningful behavioral effects. Now, smell and taste, they're so closely connected that it's often difficult to separate them. In fact, what we usually describe as the flavor of food is actually a combination of both senses. And that's why when you have a bad cold or a flu and your nose is congested, food often seems really bland, even though you know your taste receptors are not damaged and they're working perfectly normally. Now, taste is also known as gustation, and taste detects chemical molecules that are dissolved in saliva. Just like smell, taste relies on chemoreceptors. These receptors are grouped together into structures called taste buds, and they're located on the surface of the tongue. Each of those taste buds contains multiple receptor cells, and these cells are going to respond to one of the five basic taste types. We have sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. Umami is what your dad told me last night. Okay, I'm going to edit that out. Umami is often described as a savory taste, and it's produced primarily by amino acids like glutamate. Now, as dissolved food molecules interact with these receptor cells, they're going to generate neural signals that are going to travel to the brain. And in the brain, that taste information is combined with smell to then create this rich perception of flavor that we experience when we're eating. With that, let's move on to somatosensation. Unlike vision or hearing, somatosensation isn't just one sense. Instead, it's really a collection of sensory systems that are going to allow us to detect what's happening on the surface of our body and inside of it. And this includes sensations like touch, pressure, vibration, pain, and temperature. So, how does the nervous system actually detect all of those different sensations? The answer is that our skin contains several different kinds of sensory receptors, and each one is going to be specialized for detecting a particular type of stimulus. Now, because of that specialization, the nervous system can then tell the difference between something like a gentle touch or a painful one, or the difference between a cold surface and a hot one. Let's start with the Meissner corpuscles. These receptors are going to be located close to the surface of the skin, and they are especially good at detecting light touches. So every time something lightly brushes across your skin or someone gently taps you on the shoulder, the Meissner corpuscles are helping detect that stimulus. Then, a little deeper in the skin, we find the Pacinian corpuscles. These receptors are specialized for detecting deep pressure and for detecting high frequency vibration. So, if you've ever held a vibrating phone or an electric toothbrush or the handle of a power tool, the vibrations you're feeling are being detected primarily by your Pacinian corpuscles. Another important receptor is the Merkel cell. Merkel cells respond to sustained pressure rather than vibration, and they're also extremely important for detecting texture, shape, and fine details. So, for instance, whenever you run your fingers across a piece of fabric, or maybe you feel the raised dots of braille, the Merkel cells help your brain distinguish between those subtle differences. We also have Ruffini endings. These receptors are going to respond when the skin stretches. And that might not sound very exciting at first, but it's actually incredibly useful. Every time you grip a cup or you pick up a pencil, the skin on your fingers are going to stretch slightly. Ruffini endings detect that stretch and they provide information that helps the brain adjust your grip and also keep track of the position of your hands and fingers. Finally, we have free nerve endings. Some of these receptors are going to function as nociceptors and they respond to stimuli that can damage our tissues. That's what allows us to detect pain. Other free nerve endings are going to function as thermoreceptors, and that allows us to detect changes in temperature. Okay, with that, there are three more concepts that are really worth talking about here. The first is going to be the 2 point threshold. You've probably noticed that touch isn't equally sensitive everywhere on the body, and that's because different parts of the body contain different densities of sensory receptors. The 2 point threshold is simply how close 2 points can be before they start feeling like a single touch instead of two separate touches. And this threshold isn't going to be the same everywhere on the body. Areas like the fingertips and the lips are going to have much smaller 2 point thresholds, and that's because they contain a much higher density of sensory receptors. On the flip side, areas like the back are going to contain fewer receptors, so it can actually be harder to distinguish two nearby points as separate touches. Now, temperature perception has an important concept of its own called physiological zero. Physiological zero refers to the normal temperature of the skin. Temperatures that are close to this value usually aren't going to feel particularly warm or cold. Instead, what we notice are changes above or below that normal baseline. Pain also has one interesting property that really sets it apart from the other sensations we've discussed. Unlike touch or temperature, the nervous system can actually regulate how much pain information reaches the brain. And this idea is described by the gate theory of pain. According to the gate theory, pain signals are going to pass through neural circuits in the spinal cord that can either increase or decrease the amount of pain information that's transmitted to the brain. That's why, if you've ever bumped your elbow or stubbed your toe, your first instinct is often to rub the area. And when you do that, you activate those touch receptors at the same time, and it can often reduce the transmission of pain signals. And that can then effectively close the gate and make the pain feel less intense. With that, the last sensory system we need to talk about is the kinesthetic sense. This is also known as proprioception. Up to this point, we've been talking about receptors that gather information from the skin. But proprioception is a little different because it allows the nervous system to monitor what's happening inside the body. Proprioception is your awareness of where different parts of your body are located, even when you're not looking at them. So, if you were to close your eyes right now, you can still tell whether your arm is raised or if your fingers are curled up in a fist or if your knees are bent. That information comes from specialized receptors, and they're going to be found primarily in your muscles and your tendons and your joints. These receptors are constantly monitoring muscle stretches, muscle tension, and joint position. They're going to continuously send that information to the brain, and that's what allows you to maintain your posture and coordinate your movements and move through your environment. Now, with that, we've covered how our sensory systems detect information from the environment and how that information reaches the brain. To finish up this chapter, I want us to answer a question. Once all of that sensory information reaches the brain, how does it actually become the meaningful objects that we recognize every day? For example, think about what the visual system has accomplished so far. By the time that information reaches the visual cortex, the brain has already detected things like edges, colors, motion, orientation, and depth. But none of those features by themselves tell you what you're looking at. And the brain still has to combine all of that information into a single recognizable object. That process is known as object recognition. Object recognition is generally thought to rely on two complementary forms of processing. We have bottom up processing and top down processing. Bottom up processing is often called data driven processing because it begins with the sensory information itself. The brain starts by detecting simple visual features. Those individual features are then combined step by step into more and more complex representations until the brain recognizes the complete object. For example, let's say that you see a symbol or logo you've never encountered before. Since you don't already have a memory of it, your brain has to rely almost entirely on the information that's coming from your eyes. It first identifies the individual shapes and colors and boundaries, and then it gradually combines those features into a single object. Top down processing works a little differently. Instead of relying only on incoming sensory information, it also uses your previous knowledge and your previous memories and experiences to help interpret what you're seeing. So, in other words, the brain doesn't always start from scratch. It uses what it already knows to make sense of that new sensory information. For example, let's say you're walking across campus and you notice someone in the distance. Before you can make out every detail of their face, you may already recognize them from the way they walk or the clothes they're wearing or just because you expected to see them there. And in that situation, your previous experiences are helping shape your perception. Of course, these two forms of processing aren't competing with one another. They actually work together. Bottom up processing provides information about what's actually present in the environment, and top down processing helps the brain interpret that information more quickly and more efficiently. And this naturally leads us to another concept called perceptual organization. Perceptual organization refers to the brain's ability to combine individual pieces of sensory information into a single meaningful perception. Instead of treating every edge, color, and line as some independent feature, the brain is going to organize them into the objects and scenes that we experience every day. Depth perception is one example of perceptual organization in action. So earlier we discussed binocular disparity. This is where the brain compares the slightly different images that are arriving from each eye to then estimate distance. That's known as a binocular cue because it depends on information from both eyes. But the brain also relies on monocular cues, which can be perceived just using one eye. This includes cues like relative size, linear perspective, interposition, shading, and motion parallax. And then by combining both those cues, the brain is able to estimate how far away objects are and also to construct the three-dimensional world that we perceive. Another remarkable feature of perception is that the brain can often recognize complete objects even when the visual information is incomplete. This idea is captured by the Gestalt principles of perceptual organization. And these principles, they describe some of the natural shortcuts that the brain uses to organize visual information. Let's look at some of the most important examples we need to know for the MCAT. The first is the law of proximity. When objects are close together, the brain naturally assumes that they belong together. And what this means is that simply moving objects closer to one another is often enough to make us perceive them as part of the same group or the same unit. In other words, where objects are located can influence how we organize them. The next is the law of similarity. Here, the brain pays attention to how objects look. If several objects share the same color, shape, size, or some other visual feature, the brain naturally groups them together. Those objects don't even have to be right next to one another. Just making them look alike is usually enough for us to perceive them as belonging to the same group. Another important principle is the law of good continuation. The brain naturally prefers smooth, continuous patterns. So, when lines appear to follow the same path, we tend to see one continuous line instead of several separate pieces. Actually, even if those lines briefly cross one another or they're interrupted, the brain still connects them into a single continuous pattern. Sometimes the brain goes a step further. With subjective contours, it actually creates boundaries that were never drawn. What this means is that instead of seeing only the pieces that are physically present, the brain fills in the missing edges and allows us to perceive a complete shape. The law of closure works in a very similar way. When part of an object is missing, the brain naturally fills in the missing information. That's why we can still recognize a circle even with a small gap in it, or why we can identify an object that's partially hidden behind something else. Even though part of the image is missing, we still perceive the object as complete. Finally, we have the law of pregnance, which is also called the law of simplicity. Sometimes there is more than one way to interpret an image. And when that happens, the brain naturally settles on the interpretation that's the simplest and most organized. So, in other words, it naturally favors the interpretation that requires the least amount of complexity. And with that, guys, we've completed this chapter. I really hope it helps. Please let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns down below. Other than that, good luck, happy studying, and have a beautiful, beautiful day, future doctors.